The river roared in Ronan's ears as he crouched behind a boulder, his makeshift spear clutched tightly in his calloused hands. His prison jumpsuit was in tatters, the once bright orange now faded to a dirty brown after months in the wilderness. His beard was long and matted, his hair wild, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. He'd been on this godforsaken planet for almost a year now, ever since the prison transport had crashed in the rugged mountains. The guards had all died in the impact. Ronan and a handful of other prisoners had survived, only to face the harsh reality of an alien world that seemed determined to kill them. One by one, the others had succumbed to the elements, to the predators, to their own despair. But not Ronan. He had survived, despite everything. Despite the biting cold of the mountain nights, despite the strange and often hostile wildlife, despite the indigenous tribes that hunted the mountains and valleys. He'd survived because that's what he did. It was the only thing he was still good at. The sound of voices drew his attention to the river crossing downstream. A group of blue-skinned aliens, the Varga tribe. He'd learned to recognize them by their distinctive face markings, were herding a group of prisoners across the rushing water. The prisoners were blue-skinned as well, but with different markings. Another tribe, then. The endless tribal warfare of this world continued, regardless of the human wreckage that had fallen from the sky. Ronan had no intention of interfering. He'd learned the hard way to avoid the indigenous conflicts. But then his eyes fell on the smallest of the captives, a child, a little girl, stumbling as she was pushed into the fast-flowing water. Her hands were bound, making it impossible for her to swim. The current immediately began to sweep her away, her small head bobbing in the white water. The Varga warriors didn't even look in her direction. They continued driving the other prisoners across, indifferent to the child's fate. Something stirred in Ronan's chest, a feeling he thought had died long ago. Before he could think better of it, he was on his feet, racing downstream, paralleling the river's course. The little girl was being tossed by the current, her head disappearing beneath the surface, and then reappearing, gasping for air. Ronan reached a bend in the river where the current slowed slightly. Without hesitation, he plunged into the frigid water, the cold shocking his system. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, the water deeper. But he was a strong swimmer, honed by military training and the desperation of the past year. He reached the child just as she went under again. His fingers closed around her arm, and he pulled her to the surface. She was limp in his grasp, her eyes closed, her small blue face pale. Ronan tucked her under one arm and struck out for the shore, fighting the current every inch of the way. By the time he dragged himself and the child onto the rocky bank, his muscles were screaming with exhaustion. The freezing water had sapped his strength, and the current had nearly pulled them both under more than once. His lungs burned as he fought to catch his breath, the taste of the alien river bitter on his tongue. He collapsed beside her, chest heaving, and then rolled her onto her side. Water spilled from her mouth, and after a moment, she coughed weakly. Her small blue body convulsed as she expelled more water, her delicate fingers clawing at the rocky shore. When she finally drew a shuddering breath, Ronan felt a surge of relief that surprised him with its intensity. She was alive. Against all odds, they both were. Ronan sat back on his heels, suddenly aware of what he'd done. He'd exposed himself, risked his life. For what? An alien child who would probably die anyway in this harsh world. What was he thinking? But as the little girl's eyes fluttered open, revealing startling yellow irises, Ronan knew he couldn't leave her. Those eyes held a spark of fierce determination that reminded him of someone he used to be, long ago, before the military, before the court-martial, before the prison transport. He gathered the child in his arms and headed for the cave he'd been using as shelter. She weighed almost nothing, her small body shivering uncontrollably against his chest. Her wrists were raw where the crude bindings had cut into her blue skin. "You've got spirit, kid," he muttered as he carried her up the steep path. "Let's see if we can keep you alive." The cave was cold and dark, but it was shelter. Ronan placed the child on his bed of dried grasses and covered her with the thermal blanket he'd salvaged from the wreckage of the prison transport. Her blue skin looked almost purple in the dim light, a stark contrast to the orange-gray of the thermal blanket. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her small chest rising and falling irregularly. Ronan built up the small fire at the mouth of the cave, carefully arranging the wood to maximize heat while minimizing smoke. The strange purple-tinted flames cast dancing shadows on the cave walls. He positioned himself between the fire and the entrance, keeping the flames low to avoid detection. The last thing he needed was to attract attention, either from the local predators or from the Varga warriors if they decided to look for their escaped prisoner. He sharpened his makeshift spear, the rhythmic scrape of stone against bone filling the silence. Every few minutes, he'd glance at the child, watching for any change in her condition. She was so small, so fragile. On this harsh world where everything seemed designed to kill, her survival seemed like an impossibility. Yet something in her, a stubborn resilience, reminded Ronan of himself. The child slept fitfully, occasionally crying out in a language Ronan couldn't understand. He watched her through the night, replenishing the fire and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. When morning came, she was feverish, her blue skin hot to the touch. Ronan cursed under his breath. He wasn't a doctor, and he knew next to nothing about alien physiology. But he knew about survival, about field medicine. He patched up enough wounded soldiers in his time. He ventured out of the cave, moving cautiously through the rocky terrain. He needed herbs, the ones with the red leaves that seemed to have antipyretic properties. He'd used them himself when he'd been laid low with fever during his first months on this planet. When he returned to the cave, the child was awake, her yellow eyes wide with fear as she struggled to sit up. "Easy," Ronan said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The child backed away, pressing herself against the cave wall. She spoke rapidly in her language, the words too fast for Ronan to catch even if he'd understood them. "I don't understand you," he said, shaking his head. He pointed to himself. "Ronan." Then he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows in question. She hesitated, then touched her chest. "Kira," she said, her voice small but clear. "Kira," Ronan repeated. "Well, Kira, you're sick, and I'm going to try to help you. Understand?" She watched him warily as he crushed the red leaves and mixed them with water. When he offered her the crude medicine, she sniffed it suspiciously before taking a small sip. Her face contorted at the bitter taste, but she drank it all, her eyes never leaving his face. The next few days fell into a pattern. Ronan would forage for food and medicinal plants, prepare simple meals, and tend to Kira's fever. She remained cautious but gradually became less fearful. By the end of the week, her fever had broken, and she was sitting up, watching Ronan with curious eyes as he sharpened his makeshift weapons. Communication was a challenge. Ronan picked up a few words of her language, and she seemed to grasp some of his, but they relied heavily on gestures and expressions. Despite the language barrier, Ronan found himself growing attached to the child. Her resilience, her quick mind, her determined attempts to help with the daily tasks of survival, all reminded him of the values he'd once held dear, before cynicism and bitterness had consumed him. One evening, as they sat by the fire eating a stew made from a rabbit-like creature Ronan had trapped, Kira pointed to his prison jumpsuit and spoke a word he didn't recognize. "What?" he asked, pointing to the tattered uniform. She repeated the word, then made a series of gestures that suggested chains or restraints. Ronan understood. She was asking if he was a prisoner. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "I was a prisoner." He pointed to the sky. "I came from up there, another world." Kira's eyes widened, and she pointed upward as well, speaking excitedly. Ronan gathered she was asking if he was a sky spirit or something similar. He shook his head. "No, not a spirit. Just a man. A soldier." He pantomimed holding a weapon, standing at attention. I was a soldier who disobeyed orders. Bad orders. He mined someone giving commands, then himself shaking his head. Kira seemed to understand. She touched his arm, her small blue fingers surprisingly warm against his skin, and spoke softly. The words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakable. Sympathy, perhaps even respect. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Kira's presence transformed Ronan's solitary existence. Where once there had been only the desperate struggle to survive another day, now there was purpose, even moments of joy. He found himself teaching her not just how to survive in the wilderness, but how to thrive. He showed her how to track animals, reading the subtle signs they left behind. A bent blade of grass, a tuft of fur caught on thorns, the distinctive pattern of footprints in soft earth. He taught her how to set traps, using the tension of bent saplings and the natural materials around them. Her small blue hands were nimble, more dexterous than his own, and soon she was crafting snares that were more effective than his. She had a natural talent for finding edible plants, her yellow eyes spotting the subtle differences between nutritious roots and poisonous lookalikes. When she was strong enough, he began teaching her how to defend herself. They started with simple evasive movements, then progressed to basic strikes and blocks. He fashioned a practice spear for her, sized to her proportions, and showed her how to use it both defensively and offensively. The spear gives you reach, he explained, demonstrating a thrust that stopped just short of a tree trunk they were using as a target. Against a larger opponent, never let them get close enough to grapple with you. Kira nodded, her face serious as she mimicked his stance, her feet planted firmly, her grip on the practice spear correct, but still somewhat tentative. Now, Ronan continued, if they do get past your spear. He moved suddenly, knocking her practice spear aside and closing the distance between them. What do you do? Without hesitation, Kira dropped to the ground, rolling away from him and coming back to her feet with a smooth motion that Ronan had drilled into her over countless practice sessions. She had her small knife, more a sharpened stone than a proper blade, in her hand, held in the reverse grip he taught her for close combat. Ronan grinned, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. Good. Very good. Always be aware of your surroundings, he told her as they moved through the forest, her small feet carefully placed to minimize noise. Notice the way the birds fall silent when a predator is near. Feel the direction of the wind, so your scent doesn't give you away. Kira absorbed his lessons eagerly, her quick mind and natural agility making her an apt pupil. By the time a year had passed, she was helping with the hunting, setting her own snares, even crafting simple tools from bone and stone. Their communication improved as well. Ronan learned more of her language, and she picked up enough of his that they could have simple conversations. It was during one of these exchanges that Ronan learned about Kira's people, the Azuri tribe, skilled warriors who lived in the valleys beyond the eastern mountains. Father, Kira said, pointing to herself, and then making a sweeping gesture toward the east. Chief. Ronan's heart sank. She wasn't just any child. She was the daughter of a tribal chief. A child of importance, a child who was missed, a child who should be returned to her people. But the thought of parting with Kira, of returning to his solitary existence, was more painful than he'd expected. She had become not just his companion but his purpose, teaching her, protecting her, watching her grow stronger and more confident. These things had given meaning to his days. Still, he knew what he had to do. The right thing, the honorable thing. The kind of thing that the old Ronan, the soldier who had stood against illegal orders, would have done without hesitation. Kira, he said, pointing to the east. Home. We will go to your home. Her yellow eyes lit up with hope, but then darkened with concern. She gestured to the terrain between them and the eastern mountains, then made a slashing motion across her throat. The meaning was clear. The journey would be dangerous, potentially deadly. Ronan nodded grimly. Yes, dangerous. But we will go. Together. That night, as Kira slept peacefully by the fire, Ronan began preparations for their journey. He fashioned a small bow for her, sized to her proportions, and a quiver of arrows. He crafted a bone knife with a handle wrapped in the tanned hide of a forest creature. He packed dried meat, medicinal herbs, the precious thermal blanket. The journey began at dawn. Ronan had mapped out a route that would take them through the mountains rather than around them, avoiding the territories most heavily patrolled by the Varga. It would be a harder path, but a safer one. Kira was quiet as they left the cave that had been their home for the past year. She carried her new weapons proudly, her small frame straight and tall despite the weight of the pack Ronan had prepared for her. She had grown in the years since he pulled her from the river, not just physically, but in confidence and skill. "Stay close," Ronan told her as they entered the dense forest that covered the lower slopes of the mountains. "Remember what I taught you about moving quietly." The first day passed without incident. They made good progress, climbing steadily through the forest until they reached a plateau where the trees thinned out. Ronan found a sheltered spot to make camp, a natural alcove in a rocky outcropping that would hide their fire from distant eyes. As they ate their simple meal of dried meat and foraged berries, Kira spoke quietly, pointing to the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "My people," she said in her limited but improving grasp of Ronan's language, "say stars are spirits of warriors." Ronan looked up at the unfamiliar constellations. The night sky on this planet was both strange and beautiful, with swirls of cosmic dust visible to the naked eye, creating ribbons of purple and blue among the stars. "My people have similar stories," he replied. "They say the bravest warriors become stars when they die." Kira nodded sagely. "You will be bright stars someday." Ronan smiled, a rare expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "Not for a long time, I hope." Kira's answering smile faded quickly. "Varga killed many Azuri. Maybe my father." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Ronan reached out and squeezed her shoulder gently. "Your father is a chief, a warrior. He survived, and he will be very happy to see you." The journey grew more challenging as they ascended higher into the mountains. The air thinned, the temperature dropped, and the terrain became treacherous. Narrow paths wound along sheer cliffs, where a single misstep could mean death. Ronan went first, testing each foothold, reaching back to help Kira when the way was particularly difficult. On the third day, as they traversed a rocky slope, a loose stone gave way beneath Kira's foot. She slipped, a small cry escaping her lips as she began to slide toward the edge of the cliff. Ronan reacted instantly, throwing himself down and catching her wrist just as she went over the edge. For a heart-stopping moment, she dangled in space, her yellow eyes wide with terror. Ronan's muscles strained as he held her, his other hand gripping a jutting rock for stability. "Hold on," he grunted, his voice tight with effort. "I got you." Slowly, painfully, he pulled her back up onto the path. They collapsed together on the narrow ledge, breathing hard, Kira's small body trembling against his. "Thank you," she whispered when she had caught her breath. "You saved me. Again." Ronan nodded, his heart still racing. "That's what we do. We save each other." After that close call, they proceeded with even more caution. Ronan fashioned a rope from the tough, fibrous vines that grew on the mountainside, tying Kira to himself when they had to cross particularly dangerous sections. On the fifth day, they crested a ridge and beheld a breathtaking view. A vast valley spread out below them, verdant and lush compared to the stark mountains. A river, perhaps the same one from which Ronan had rescued Kira, wound through the valley like a silver ribbon. The twin suns of this alien world were setting, one already dipping below the horizon, the other casting long shadows across the landscape. The sky was a riot of colors, deep purples and fiery oranges blending into stripes of blue-green that had no equivalent in Earth's skies. The valley floor was a patchwork of different ecosystems. To the north, grasslands stretched to the horizon, the tall stalks swaying in the evening breeze like a golden sea. Clusters of bizarre tree-like plants dotted the plains, their spiral trunks supporting umbrella-shaped canopies. To the south, dense forests of blue-leaf trees covered the undulating terrain, broken occasionally by clearings or rocky outcroppings. Ronan could make out the smoke from several settlements, thin columns rising into the still air, marking the locations of villages or encampments. Most were concentrated in the northern sector of the valley. Varga territory, Kira said, pointing to the northern part of the valley where most of the smoke columns rose. Then she pointed to the eastern reaches, where the valley narrowed and entered another range of mountains. Azuri there, beyond Far Mountains. She spoke with certainty, but Ronan could detect the slight tremor in her voice. For all her confidence, this was still a perilous journey into the unknown. She had been a child when the Varga had taken her, and her memories of the geography might not be entirely reliable. But it was the only lead they had, the only direction that offered any hope of reuniting her with her people. Ronan studied the terrain, planning their route. They would need to descend into the valley and cross it, avoiding Varga patrols. Then they would need to navigate the eastern mountains to reach the Azuri territory. "We'll rest here tonight," he decided. "Start down at first light." They found a suitable campsite in a small cave, its entrance partially concealed by thick bushes with star-shaped purple leaves. The cave was shallow but dry, its floor covered with fine sand that would make for comfortable sleeping. Kira set about gathering firewood while Ronan cleared the area, checking for signs of previous inhabitants, animal or otherwise. He found claw marks on one wall, deep gouges in the stone that suggested a powerful predator had used this cave in the past. But the marks were old, the edges softened by time, and there were no recent tracks or droppings to indicate current occupation. "We'll take turns on watch," he told Kira when she returned with an armful of twisted branches. 2 hours each. "I'll take first watch." She nodded, arranging the wood in the small fire pit she had dug in the sand. Using the fire-starting kit Ronan had crafted, a hardwood drill and a softwood base, she soon had a small flame going. It was a skill she had mastered months ago, one of the many survival techniques Ronan had taught her. As they sat by their small fire, the entrance to the cave covered with a makeshift curtain of branches to hide the light, Ronan sensed a change in Kira. She was quieter than usual, her movements restless, her yellow eyes often darting to the cave entrance, as if she expected someone to appear. "What's wrong?" he asked as they sat by their small fire, the entrance to the cave covered with a makeshift curtain of branches to hide the light. Kira poked at the fire with a stick, not meeting his eyes. "What happened when we reach Azuri? You stay." "I don't know," he admitted. "That will be up to your father, your people. They might not want me to stay." Kira looked up at him, her yellow eyes reflecting the firelight. "I want you stay." Ronan felt a lump in his throat. "I know, kid. Let's just focus on getting there safely. All right. One day at a time." The descent into the valley the next day was arduous. The path was steep and often non-existent, forcing them to create their own way down through craggy outcroppings and dense underbrush. By midday, they had reached the valley floor, and Ronan called a halt beside a small stream to rest and refill their water containers. As Kira knelt by the stream, something caught Ronan's attention, a movement in the bushes on the opposite bank. He tensed, reaching slowly for his spear. "Kira," he said quietly, "come here." Slowly. She looked up, instantly alert to the tension in his voice. She rose and moved to his side, her hand going to the bone knife at her hip. The bushes parted, and a creature emerged, a predator that Ronan recognized with a jolt of fear. The locals called them shadow cats, large feline-like beasts with 6 legs and black, almost metallic-looking fur. Their hunting strategy was simple but effective. They paralyzed their prey with a neurotoxin delivered through retractable spines in their front paws, then took their time feeding. This one was large, its sleek body rippling with muscle as it slunk down to the water's edge. It hadn't seen them yet. The wind was in their favor, but it would soon pick up their scent. "Back away," Ronan whispered, very slowly. No sudden movements. They began to retreat, step by careful step. But fate was not on their side. Kira's foot came down on a dry branch, which snapped with a sound that seemed deafening in the tense silence. The shadow cat's head whipped around, its amber eyes locking onto them. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pressure valve, and crouched, preparing to spring. "Run," Ronan shouted, pushing Kira behind him. Into the trees. The shadow cat launched itself across the stream in a single bound, its powerful legs propelling it through the air. The creature was a blur of midnight fur and gleaming claws, its 6 limbs perfectly coordinated in a deadly attack. Its maw opened, revealing rows of serrated teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. Ronan braced himself, spear at the ready. Time seemed to slow as the predator arced through the air toward him. He could see every detail, the ripple of muscles beneath the sleek fur, the retractable spines extending from its front paws, glistening with poison, the hungry gleam in its amber eyes. This was a perfect killing machine, evolved over millennia to be the apex predator of this harsh world. But Ronan was no easy prey. He had survived a year on this planet alone, had faced down other predators, had learned the hard way which creatures to avoid and which could be fought. As the shadow cat descended toward him, he thrust upward with all his strength, putting the weight of his body behind the spear. The spear caught the shadow cat in the chest, the force of its leap driving the point deep. But momentum carried the beast forward, and its weight bore Ronan to the ground. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder as one of the toxic spines grazed him. Ronan rolled, dislodging the wounded creature. It writhed on the ground, the spear still embedded in its chest, hissing and spitting in pain and rage. Ronan staggered to his feet, his left arm already going numb from the toxin. He drew his knife with his right hand, preparing to finish the job. But the shadow cat, despite its mortal wound, was not done fighting. It swiped at Ronan with one massive paw, the spines fully extended. Ronan dodged, but his movements were slowed by the spreading numbness. The creature's claws caught his leg, tearing through the fabric of his pants and into the flesh beneath. Ronan fell to one knee, the pain sharp and immediate. The shadow cat dragged itself toward him, determined to take him with it into death. Ronan raised his knife, knowing he might not have the strength for a killing blow. Then there was a whistling sound, and an arrow appeared as if by magic in the shadow cat's eye. The creature jerked, then went still. Kira stood a few yards away, her small bow in hand, another arrow already nocked. "Good shot," Ronan gasped, the world starting to spin around him. "Really good shot." Then the darkness took him. Ronan drifted in and out of consciousness. He was aware of Kira's voice, urgent and frightened, of small hands dragging him across rough ground, of a fire's warmth, of bitter-tasting liquid being poured into his mouth. But these sensations came and went, disconnected fragments rather than a coherent experience. When he finally regained full consciousness, the first thing he saw was Kira's face, drawn with worry, her yellow eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She was grinding something in a crude stone mortar, but she stopped as soon as she noticed he was awake. "Ronan," she exclaimed, setting aside her work and moving to his side. "You wake." Ronan tried to sit up but fell back with a groan. His shoulder felt as if it had been burned, and his leg throbbed with pain. "How long?" he managed to ask. 2 days, Kira replied, helping him drink from a water container. "Poison strong. I make medicine, like you teach." She indicated the mortar, which contained a paste made from what looked like the blue fungus that grew on certain trees in the valley. Ronan recognized it, a natural antidote to the shadow cat's toxin, something he'd discovered through desperate experimentation during his early days on the planet. "Smart girl," he said, his voice hoarse. "You saved my life." Kira's face broke into a relieved smile. "You saved mine before. Now we even." Despite the pain, Ronan chuckled. "I guess we are." As his strength gradually returned over the next few days, Ronan was forced to acknowledge a hard truth. Kira was no longer just his student. She had become his partner, capable of making decisions and taking actions that had kept them both alive. The child he had pulled from the river 4 years ago was growing into a formidable young person, one who combined the best aspects of her people's warrior culture with the survival skills Ronan had taught her. The rest of their trek through the valley was mercifully uneventful. They moved cautiously, staying within the cover of the forests that dotted the valley floor, avoiding the open grasslands where they would be exposed to view. Ronan's injured legs slowed their pace, but Kira was patient, adjusting her stride to match his limping gait. They encountered signs of the Varga, a hunting party's campsite, abandoned but recent, tracks of what appeared to be a patrol, smoke rising from distant settlements, but managed to avoid direct contact. Ronan's years of military training served them well, his instincts for danger and evasion keeping them safe. As they approached the eastern mountains, the terrain began to rise, the forests giving way to rocky foothills. Kira grew more animated, pointing out landmarks she recognized from her early childhood. A distinctively shaped rock formation, a waterfall that cascaded down a cliffside, a grove of trees with silver-blue leaves that shimmered in the sunlight. "Soon," she said, her voice vibrating with excitement. "Ajuri territory soon." Ronan shared her relief at nearing their destination, but he also felt a growing unease. How would the Ajuri receive them? Would they believe Kira's story, or would they assume Ronan had been her captor rather than her protector? These concerns were pushed aside when they crested a hill and saw, in the valley below, a Varga patrol. The warriors were moving in their direction, their blue bodies adorned with the war paint and trophies that distinguished them from the Ajuri. There were 6 of them, armed with spears and bows, moving with the confident stride of predators in their own territory. Ronan pulled Kira down beside him, using the crest of the hill for cover. "Varga," he whispered, unnecessarily. "We need to go around them." Kira studied the patrol, her yellow eyes narrowed. "Too late," she said. "They see us." She pointed to one of the warriors, who was gesturing in their direction and speaking urgently to his companions. Ronan cursed under his breath. Their options were limited. They could try to run, but with his injured leg, Ronan doubted they could outpace the Varga warriors. They could try to hide, but in this terrain, with the warriors already alerted to their presence, concealment would be difficult. That left fighting, a desperate option with the odds heavily against them. "Kira," Ronan said, his voice calm despite the danger, "I want you to run. Head east, stay in the hills. I'll hold them off, give you a head start." Kira looked at him incredulously. "No, we fight together." "This isn't a debate," Ronan said, his tone hardening. "You're going to your people, to your father. That's what this whole journey has been about." Kira set her jaw stubbornly. "I not leave you." The Varga were moving uphill now, spreading out to approach from multiple angles. There was no more time for argument. "Fine," Ronan growled. "But you stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understand?" Kira nodded, though the defiant set of her jaw suggested she had no intention of abandoning him. She readied her bow, nocking an arrow with practiced ease. Ronan took a deep breath, steadying himself. His leg ached, and his shoulder, though mostly healed from the Shadow Cat's toxin, was still stiff. Not ideal conditions for a fight against 6 trained warriors, but he'd faced worse odds and survived. The first Varga warrior appeared over the crest of the hill, spear at the ready. Kira's arrow caught him in the chest before he could react, the impact sending him tumbling back down the slope. The others responded with shouts of rage, charging upward with renewed determination. Ronan braced himself, spear in hand. As the next warrior crested the hill, Ronan thrust, catching him in the throat. The warrior fell, gurgling, his hands clutching at the fatal wound. But there was no time to recover. The next attacker was already upon them, with more close behind. The battle became a blur of desperate movement. Ronan used his spear to keep the warriors at bay, his greater reach giving him an advantage in the initial exchanges. Kira's arrows found their marks with impressive accuracy, wounding if not killing 2 more of the attackers. But the Varga were skilled fighters, and they adapted quickly, spreading out to flank the defenders. Ronan found himself facing 2 warriors at once, their spears jabbing at him from different angles. They worked in tandem, one attacking high while the other aimed for his legs, forcing him to defend on multiple fronts. Their blue faces were contorted with battle rage, yellow eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a kill. He parried one thrust with the shaft of his spear, the impact sending vibrations up his arms. He pivoted, using the momentum to dodge the second attack, the enemy spear missing his abdomen by inches. The warriors were skilled, their movements fluid and practiced. These were no raw recruits but seasoned fighters who had faced many battles. Ronan countered with a sweep of his spear, forcing one warrior to jump back. He followed with a thrust toward the second, who barely managed to deflect the blow with his own weapon. For a moment, Ronan had them on the defensive, his greater reach and military training giving him an edge despite being outnumbered. But his injured leg betrayed him. As he stepped forward to press his advantage, a sharp pain shot through his thigh. The wounded muscle spasmed, and he stumbled, his stance faltering. One of the Vargas seized the opportunity, driving his spear toward Ronan's exposed side with a triumphant snarl. The blow never landed. Kira had abandoned her bow for her knife, and she darted in with startling speed, slashing at the warrior's arm. The Varga howled in pain, his spear falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. Kira followed up with a thrust to his abdomen, a move Ronan had taught her, targeting the soft spot just below the ribs. The warrior collapsed, his cry cut short. But the momentary victory came at a cost. The second warrior swung his spear like a club, catching Kira across the shoulders and sending her sprawling. Ronan roared with fury, driving forward despite the pain in his leg. His spear took the warrior in the chest, the force of the impact driving him backward off the hilltop. Ronan turned to check on Kira, who was struggling to her feet, shaken but apparently uninjured. The remaining Varga, now just 2, were regrouping at the base of the hill, clearly reassessing their approach. "We need to move," Ronan said, retrieving Kira's bow and handing it to her. "They'll be back, probably with reinforcements." They retreated eastward, staying in the hills where the terrain offered some protection. Ronan's leg was bleeding again. The wound reopened during the fight, but he pushed through the pain. They needed distance between themselves and the Varga, and they needed it quickly. "The Varga will be hunting for us now," Ronan warned as they pushed through a thicket of thorny bushes. "We've killed 4 of their warriors. They won't let that pass." Kira nodded grimly. She had blood on her face, not her own, and her eyes were hard with the aftermath of battle. In that moment, she looked older than her years, a warrior forged in the crucible of survival. "We move at night," she suggested. "Hide during day." Ronan nodded. "Good thinking. We'll find a place to rest until dark, then push on." They found a hidden ravine, its steep sides providing natural protection, and settled in to wait for nightfall. Kira insisted on examining Ronan's leg, cleaning the wound with water from their dwindling supply and binding it with strips torn from her own clothing. "You fight well," Ronan told her as she worked. "That move with the knife, perfect execution." Kira looked up, a small smile of pride on her face. "Good teacher." As darkness fell, they prepared to move out. The night was clear, the twin moons of this world casting enough light to see by, but not so much as to make them easily visible from a distance. They traveled in silence, Ronan leading the way, choosing their path with care to minimize noise and leave as little trace as possible. They walked through the night, stopping only when Ronan's leg finally gave out and he collapsed, his face gray with exhaustion and pain. Dawn was breaking, a faint lavender glow on the eastern horizon. They had made good progress, but Ronan knew they needed to find shelter before full daylight exposed them to any pursuing Varga. Kira scouted ahead, moving with the stealth Ronan had taught her, and returned with news of a small cave set into a hillside, partially hidden by a rockfall. It would serve as their shelter for the day. As they rested, taking turns standing watch, Ronan assessed their situation. They were close to Azuri lands now, perhaps just a day's journey away, according to Kira. But his leg was in bad shape, the wound inflamed despite Kira's care. Fever was beginning to set in, a dangerous complication in their already precarious circumstances. By the time night fell again, Ronan knew he was in trouble. The fever had worsened, and he could barely put weight on his injured leg. He considered telling Kira to go on without him, to make the final push to her people's territory alone. But he knew she would refuse, and he wasn't sure she could find her way safely without him, especially with Varga patrols likely still searching for them. They set out again, Ronan leaning heavily on a staff of wood that Kira had found and stripped of branches. Their pace was painfully slow, but they pushed on, driven by the knowledge that safety lay just ahead. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Unlike the Varga territory, this valley was dotted with structured settlements, circular arrangements of domed dwellings, fields of cultivated crops, paths connecting the various communities. People moved about in the distance, their blue skin distinctive against the greenery. Azuri, Kira breathed, her voice filled with wonder and nostalgia. My people. They descended into the valley, Ronan leaning heavily on his staff, his leg barely supporting his weight. Kira stayed close to his side, her yellow eyes scanning constantly for danger. They followed a stream that wound down from the hills, figuring it would lead to one of the settlements. They were within sight of the nearest village when they were spotted. A sentry, positioned on a raised platform at the village's edge, called out an alarm. Within moments, a group of warriors emerged, moving swiftly to intercept the strangers. Stay calm, Ronan advised Kira, though he could feel her trembling with excitement and nervousness beside him. Let them approach, no sudden movements. The Azuri warriors surrounded them, spears leveled, faces stern. They were similar to the Varga in appearance, with blue skin and yellow eyes, but their facial markings were different, more elaborate, with swirling patterns that extended from their foreheads down to their necks. One of the warriors, who wore additional decorations that suggested a position of authority, addressed them in the Azuri language. Kira responded hesitantly, her words halting after years of disuse. The warrior's eyes widened, and he stepped closer, studying her face intently. Ronan tensed, ready to defend Kira if necessary, but the warrior's next action took him by surprise. The Azuri dropped to one knee, bowing his head. The others followed suit, their weapons lowered. Kira turned to Ronan, her face radiant with joy. They recognize me, she said. They say I am Kira, daughter of Chief Azor, returned from the dead. The warriors escorted them to the village, maintaining a respectful distance. Word of their arrival spread quickly, and by the time they reached the central clearing, a crowd had gathered. The people murmured among themselves, pointing at Kira and then at Ronan, their expressions a mix of awe and suspicion. A large dwelling dominated the clearing, its entrance draped with colorful banners. From this structure emerged a tall, imposing figure, an Azuri male in his prime, his blue skin adorned with the most elaborate markings Ronan had yet seen. A headdress of feathers and bones crowned his head, and a cloak of some shimmering material hung from his shoulders. Chief Azor, Kira's father. The chief's eyes fixed on Kira, his expression frozen in disbelief. Kira stepped forward, her voice clear as she spoke in her native tongue. The chief raised a hand, silencing the murmurs, and responded with a question. Kira nodded and turned to Ronan. He asks if you are the one who saved me from the river. Ronan nodded wearily. Yes. Tell him I found you in the river, being swept away, after the Varga raided your people. Kira translated, and the chief's expression shifted, his yellow eyes narrowing as he studied Ronan with new intensity. He spoke again, his tone commanding. He wants proof, Kira said. Proof that you saved me, that you are not a Varga trick." Ronan thought for a moment, then reached into the pouch at his belt. He withdrew a small object, a carved figure made from a soft stone, something he had made for Kira during their first winter together. It represented a creature from one of the stories he had told her, a mythical beast from Earth's legends. He handed it to Kira. "Show him this. Tell him you've carried it since our first year together." Kira took the carving, her fingers tracing its familiar contours. She approached her father and presented it, speaking earnestly. The chief took the carving, examining it with a frown, then looked at his daughter with a question in his eyes. Kira continued speaking, her words flowing more naturally now as she recounted her story. The capture by the Varga, the attempted drowning, Ronan's rescue, the years spent in his care, the journey home. As she spoke, she demonstrated some of the fighting techniques Ronan had taught her, movements that were clearly not Azuri in origin. The blade pressed against Ronan's throat was cold and sharp, a stark reminder of his precarious situation. The tribal chief's blue-skinned face twisted with rage, his yellow eyes narrowing to slits as he leaned closer. "You dare bring my daughter back as if you are her savior. You, an outsider, a pink skin who reeks of deception." The chief's voice was a low growl that sent ripples of tension through the assembled warriors. Their blue skin glistened in the strange purple light of the twin suns setting beyond the mountain range. Ronan didn't flinch. He'd faced death too many times to fear it now. The years of hardship had stripped away his fear, leaving only a hollow resignation. He could feel the blood trickling down his neck where the blade had already broken skin. "Father, stop." The voice that cut through the tension was clear and commanding. Kira stepped forward, her slender blue figure moving with the grace and confidence that Ronan had taught her. At 16, she was no longer the frightened child he had pulled from the river. She was a warrior. "This man did not kidnap me," she continued, her yellow eyes flashing with determination. "He saved me when the Varga raiders threw me into the river to drown. For 5 cycles, he has protected me, fed me, taught me to survive." She drew the bone knife Ronan had crafted for her from its sheath at her hip. "He taught me to fight." The tribal chief's expression didn't change, but the pressure of the blade against Ronan's throat lessened slightly. "The Varga. You were captured by the Varga." "Yes," Kira replied, her voice steady despite the painful memories. "And when they considered me too weak to be worth keeping as a slave, they discarded me into the river. Ronan risked his life to save mine. He owes you nothing. If anything, you owe him everything." The chief looked from Kira to Ronan, conflict evident in his eyes. "How do I know this is not some deception? The Varga are cunning." Kira's response was to step back and assume a fighting stance that Ronan had taught her, balanced, centered, ready for attack or defense. She performed a series of moves, a deadly dance that combined Ronan's military training with her natural grace and strength. It was a display not just of skill, but of the bond between teacher and student, of trust forged through shared survival. When she finished, she stood tall, her chest heaving slightly from the exertion. "Would a Varga trick teach me this? Would a deceiver spend years making me stronger, teaching me to survive, to fight? The Varga throw away those they consider weak. This man saved one they discarded and made her strong." The chief slowly lowered his blade from Ronan's throat. He studied the human's face, as if searching for the truth in his eyes. "If what my daughter says is true, then I owe you a debt that can never be repaid." Ronan met his gaze steadily. "I didn't do it for debt or gratitude. I did it because it was right." The chief nodded slowly, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He turned to the assembled warriors and spoke in a commanding voice. The tension in the air dissipated, replaced by a tentative acceptance. "My father says you are to be treated as an honored guest." Kira translated, her face alight with joy. "He has ordered a feast to celebrate my return, and to honor the one who saved me." That night, as the Azuri celebrated with music, dance, and food, Ronan watched from the sidelines, his leg properly treated by the tribe's healers, his fever receding under their expert care. Kira moved among her people, reuniting with family and friends, but she returned frequently to Ronan's side, as if to reassure herself that he was still there. Late in the evening, Chief Azor approached Ronan, sitting beside him with a dignity that commanded respect. He spoke, and Kira, never far from Ronan, translated. "My father says that among the Azuri there is a saying, 'The measure of a warrior is not in the enemies he kills, but in the lives he saves.' He says that by this measure you are a great warrior indeed." The chief continued speaking, his voice formal, almost ceremonial. Kira's eyes widened as she listened. When she turned to Ronan, her face was glowing with happiness. "He says you have not just returned his daughter, you have returned her stronger, wiser, a true warrior. He says the Azuri owe you a debt that can never be repaid." She paused, then added with barely contained excitement, "He invites you to stay with the Azuri, to become part of our tribe, to be my second father." Ronan stared at her, then at the chief, stunned by the offer. Acceptance, belonging, a place among these people, a purpose beyond mere survival. Things he had believed were forever beyond his reach. "Tell him," Ronan said, his voice rough with emotion. "Tell him I would be honored." And so Ronan found a new home among the Azuri. His skills as a warrior and survivor earned him respect, and his role as Kira's protector and teacher gave him a unique position within the tribe. The chief appointed him as an advisor, valuing his outsider's perspective and his knowledge of tactics and strategy. Kira continued to flourish, growing into a young woman who combined the best of both worlds, the honor and tradition of the Azuri, and the adaptability and resourcefulness Ronan had taught her. She became a bridge between Ronan and the tribe, helping him learn their language and customs, explaining his strange ways to her people. Years passed, and Ronan's past as a prisoner, a fugitive, a broken soldier, receded into memory. He found peace among the Azuri, a peace he had never known on Earth or during his solitary years in the wilderness. He found purpose in teaching, in protecting, in building rather than destroying. And in Kira, he found something he had never expected to find on this alien world, or indeed anywhere in the universe: family.